So welcome back to History and Chat on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock, where I try and answer some of your questions about what might be happening in the news. And I have a lot of terrific stuff today, questions that people sent in and that had really interesting answers, because, I do actually do a lot of research on these before I answer them. Although, that being said, remember, I am just one person. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a historian who studies politics and the economy primarily in America. I'm an American historian. But I am a historian, so I know a lot about the way politics works. I know a lot about the way economics work in America. But that being said, I don't have a staff. I do everything myself. So I am speaking for myself when I do these, and I will make mistakes. If I do make mistakes, call me out on them and we'll fix them. But just so you know, that's what I'm up to here. So let me get right down to it. A lot of interesting questions, and starting with the one from two people, actually, both Sarah Cosby and Tomas Feyer, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, wanted to know more about executive orders. What are they, how are they addressed, and what do they mean for our political system and for American society? Well, executive orders are fascinating. They are simply the orders that the head of the executive branch gives to the people who work for him or her. So they are almost literally what a boss says to his or her employees. This is what our goal is, and here's how you are going to implement it. It is literally an order from the executive. Now, that's interesting right now because, of course, we are in a struggle for a definition of what exactly the powers of the executive are. There are three branches in the American government. There's the legislative branch, and that's Congress and all the offices associated with Congress. There is the judicial branch, and that is our court system. And then finally, there is the executive branch. And when you learned about that in fifth grade, if you learned about that in fifth grade, you hear about the executive branch, and the little map they show you always just says the president. Well, it's not just the president. It's the president and all the people who work in that branch. The executive branch actually now takes up office buildings. It's got a lot of people in it. And right now there's a real question over the power of that executive branch and the power of the person who runs that executive branch to have oversight from Congress. What is the correct relationship amongst the different three branches of government? So and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. So literally the way an executive order works is that it is a directive from the president to the people who work for him or her, saying how they should implement some particular part of governmental policy. There's a real question at first, or there was a real question at first, about whether or not executive orders had to be in line with the Constitution. And the Supreme Court decided that you did, in fact, have to have a constitutional basis for an executive order. So what that's proved to us is that executive orders are subject to judicial review. That is, the courts can say, that's not legal, you can't do that. And that's how there is some check on executive orders. And it's worth pointing out that executive orders are in force until they are canceled or revoked or declared unlawful by the courts, or until they expire. So that's what they actually look like. Now, here's the history behind them. Every president has issued executive orders. George Washington issued the first when he ordered the heads of his department to give him, and I quote, a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States, unquote. And it was not at the time labeled an executive order. It was just he had to know what was going on in his department. So he asked the people, in the country, so he asked the people at the head of different departments what things looked like to them. And that's especially interesting to me because until the 20th century, if you want to know anything about what's happening at the departmental level in American government, the best place to go is to the annual reports, to the statements to Congress that the president makes once a year. We know them now as State of the Union addresses, but they're great until probably the middle of the 20th century, because the way those were written is that the president would literally go to the Secretary of the Treasury and say, hey, Salmon, if it were the Civil War, tell me what happened. this year? What do I need to know? And the head of that department would write up what the country looked like for that department that year. So we get great information from these snapshots of what the heads of departments thought were important in that particular year. So if you ever just want to figure out what 1888 looked like, for example, a really good fast place to start is with the State of the Union, because it will be kind of the synopsis of everything that the heads of departments said. Anyway, Washington does that at first. That's the first executive order, which gives us a baseline for what an executive order might look like. The ideas of executive orders are not really codified in any way until 1907. In 1907, the State Department, the Department of State, decides that it's got to pull some kind of order into these, and they go back and they put numbers on executive orders back to 1862. And the first executive order that they call an executive order was actually by Abraham Lincoln. And it's where we get the name executive order. And that's because he issued an order in 1862 called the Executive Order Establishing a Provisional Court in Louisiana. And that's where we get the words executive order. By the way, I think I said that every president has issued executive orders, and that's wrong. That's a mistake. In fact, William Henry Harrison does not order any executive decision-making because he, of course, gets sick when he's giving his inaugural address, and he dies 31 days later. So he basically doesn't do anything. Trivia there, but not every president has issued an executive order because William Henry Harrison croaked. So it goes. Anyway, so if that's where we get our first, or the concept of our first executive order, one of my favorite little tidbits about executive orders is that we have some very, very famous ones. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. So this is not an unusual thing for a president to have done. Telling people how they should enforce the laws or how policy should work is pretty much something they have to do in their line of work. Now, of course, that being said, presidents have in the past used executive orders to extend their authority because they can't get Congress to do what they want to have done, or Congress feels to them to be moving too slowly, or Congress might simply not be able to react as quickly as a president wants it to. So on occasion, presidents have issued executive orders that don't hold up. And really famously, that would be like an executive order like that under Truman, who in the 1950s, I think it was 1952, during the Korean War, was faced with a strike in the steel mills. And he decided to put the country's steel mills under federal control. And actually, the strikers thought that was just a ducky idea, but the people who owned the mines did not. And they challenged it, took it to the Supreme Court, and there was a Supreme Court decision handed down called Youngstown Sheet and Lumber Company versus Sawyer. And that Supreme Court decision found unconstitutional Truman's executive order number 10340, which had taken over the steel mills. They found it unconstitutional because he had seized private property without any authorization from Congress. So that gets clawed back, and that puts some limits on what a president can do with an executive order. Other presidents have used them pretty widely and fairly heavy-handedly. FDR, for example, is famous as having issued the most of our executive orders, and he started right off the bat as soon as he was inaugurated with his declaration of a bank holiday, a new word there to try and make people feel more confident about the facts the banks were falling like dominoes when he became a president. So he declared a bank holiday, but he went on to use an executive order more than 3,000 times, as I recall. Other presidents also have used them for quite dramatic things, like, for example, Eisenhower used an executive order to desegregate the schools. That was an executive order as well. And famously, of course, FDR, with his executive order 9066, gave to the American military the authority to remove any or all people in a military zone. And if you listen to the words that I just put together there, reading behind that, what that did is it led to the internment of Japanese Americans in internment camps across the western part of the United States. And that was, again, based in an executive order. Of course, obviously, the American Congress and the American government apologized for that in 1888. 19. I'm sorry, I've been in the 19th century all day. In 1988. They apologized for the Japanese internment camps. And okay, finally, so with Trump, the executive order that many people think of when they think of Trump is his executive order as soon as he took office, as he said, protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. And this was popularly known as the travel ban or the Muslim ban. And this was his attempt to ban immigration from 7 Muslim majority countries into America on the grounds that this would keep terrorists out of the country. This was challenged pretty quickly, and a federal court stayed that executive order on January 28, 2017. But more recently, on June 26, 2018, the Supreme Court of the United States said that, in fact, that travel ban did fall under his power as an executive. So the executive order, they said, should stand. Now, this is interesting because, of course, last night at about 10:08, guys, I was writing about it then, Trump tweeted that he was going to issue an executive order banning all immigration from America. And that was a really interesting executive or claim, because as we dissect it today, it doesn't seem to do much of anything at all that hasn't already been done because of COVID-19. And it's also not clear that it's going to be legal to try and stop immigration on the grounds of infection, and the protection of the American worker, because, as I say, the Supreme Court has said he has to have explicit constitutional authority, and there does not appear to be constitutional authority for those two things he has claimed. Now, that being said, it will get balled up in the courts if, in fact, he goes ahead and does it. Really, he was just simply signaling to his base to try and convince them that he was working for them. This is a significant thing, though, and tying back to the travel ban is a significant thing, because it does touch on this thing I keep harping on before the Supreme Court, and also in the thoughts of a number of federal judges now, and also in a number of people in Congress, the idea of the strong unitary executive. That's the unitary executive theory. And that's the idea that as the head of the executive branch, the president cannot be checked by members of Congress or by anybody within his executive branch. And that, of course, would include the Department of Justice and the FBI, which is in the Department of Justice. So if, in fact, the Supreme Court continues to uphold the idea of strong executive orders and a strong executive, it's unclear what executive orders will come to look like in the future. All right, so Tomas also asked about state executive orders, which are a little bit different. And they're also interesting and in the news right now, because the concept is the same. The idea is that the state governors are able to issue orders for the implementation of policies within their states, but they're a little bit different simply because of the way state governments are set up. One of the things that state governments that state governors can do with state executive orders is to affect budgets. So, for example, if a state begins to run seriously behind its budget goals, it's spending way more money than it's taking in, most governors can go ahead and issue executive orders demanding across-the-board cuts from that state, or from the agencies of the state. They also can do things to protect their states. So, for example, in states that have droughts, governor can go ahead and issue orders about how much water somebody can use. And finally, of course, they can do things for the welfare of the state in general. And most of our orders about the coronavirus, the orders to stay at home, what can open and what can't, most of those are executive orders because they protect the welfare of the state and the health of the state and the police power of the state, which is reserved to the states under an amendment to the Constitution. So state orders are a little bit different. Tomas also asked, and just for people who really want to get into the weeds here, he referred to the fact that in the Civil War, Indiana seemed to have enabled its governor, a guy named Oliver P. Morton, to go ahead and use executive orders to get around the fact that the legislature did not want to fund the Civil War. But in fact, Morton didn't do that under executive orders. He did do it basically by doing an end run around, probably an unconstitutional for that matter, end run around the state state legislature by raising money from private donors to try and keep the state in the game in the Civil War, and it worked. The state legislature had adjourned without providing any money to raise troops after the adjournment of the legislature, with the idea that Indiana would have to drop out of the Civil War on the side of the Union and therefore would join the Confederacy, or at least not hurt. And that was a wildly good place for the camera to die. I'm back up again. If somebody can tell me that they can see me. Just as I finished that sentence, the system went down here. And there we go. Somebody's back on. Sorry about that. I have no idea what happened. But as I say, the timing was wonderful. All right. So that is executive orders. Now here's another question that people asked. Both Lynn Jensen and Sarma Murdian wanted to know how it is, as Lynn says, how can Trump continuously go around the checks and balances in our system? It seems like he's doing what he wants without consequences. And Sarma asked, how is it that the president is inciting violence against state governments and is allowed to get away with it? Great questions both, and they go back to the founding of the country. So first of all, the president can't do these things. At least in theory, the president can't do these things. But when the founders set up our governmental system, they made a number of assumptions that have turned out not to be true. So first of all, the founders made the assumption that the people who were elected to the Senate, and especially, but also the House of Representatives, would be really, really seriously concerned about their own power, that they would not be willing to share it, and they would check an executive. If an executive got too big for his britches, they would check him. And they actually operated on the idea that everybody would be really, really jealous of their own power. And so they would make sure nobody really got out of hand. And the way they did that was they set up the idea of impeachment. If you had a president who was overreaching, who was abusing his power in some way, first the House of Representatives had to look at that and say, we're not happy with what this guy's doing. We think he's misbehaving, and here's the ways in which we don't trust him. Literally, to impeach somebody means that you don't trust them. And the articles of impeachment are very vague in the Constitution, with the idea that they're going to enable people to push back against whatever might come up. They didn't want to be too careful to define what, in fact, impeachment might look like, because they didn't know. They hadn't written the government yet. They hadn't had the government happen yet. And that's actually one of the problems that was so frustrating for historians during the impeachment trial or the impeachment discussion of Donald Trump, is a number of people saying, well, he has to have violated a specific law. Well, of course, the founders didn't write it that way, because there were no specific laws yet. They were really trying to get at the problem of the abuse of power by a rogue executive. And they didn't think it was going to be terribly hard to do, because on the one hand, you were going to have people who were worried about government overreach or executive overreach, but at the same time, they wouldn't want their own power checked very much. So they were going to be able to meet some kind of a happy medium with that. They also did not have the idea of parties. The founders did not like the idea of parties. They thought they were unhealthy for a republic, and they expected that America was going to be able to survive without them. So they didn't expect that impeachment would get tangled up in the idea of parties. And this starts to happen in the early republic under Thomas Jefferson. He begins to use impeachment for political ends. He tries to purge the government of his political opponents, and he does so, first by taking on a judge who is a mess. I mean, he's an alcoholic, and he's just crazy in the courtroom, and getting rid of him was no biggie. But getting rid of the next person that Jefferson went after was. People were like, you may not like him, but he's doing his job fine. And that's really when the idea of impeachment as a political process died. And it dies really until the impeachment of Bill Clinton, which is pretty clearly a partisan effort. The impeachment before that, Andrew Johnson, was not like that. So how does that happen? So there really isn't any, there's talk of impeachment between the Jefferson administration and Andrew Johnson in the 1860s after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, but it doesn't happen. There's not a presidential impeachment event. There's certainly talk of it with James Buchanan, but it doesn't happen. And to some degree, Franklin Pierce as well, but it doesn't happen until Andrew Johnson. And what happens with Andrew Johnson is somewhat instructive for where we are now and the whole question of the ability of presidents to attack members of Congress, for example, or state governments and get away with it. Because what happens with Johnson is Johnson hates the Republican Party. Johnson's a Democrat, even though he actually ran on a unity ticket with Abraham Lincoln. That in 1864, Abraham Lincoln did not run as a Republican. He ran as a Union candidate. It was an attempt to start a new political party, and by bringing Andrew Johnson on board, he was a Democrat. Most people forget that, but it was this weird little blip in political party history. So Johnson doesn't like and it falls apart immediately after the election. So Johnson doesn't like the Republicans, and he really is afraid that they are going to guarantee that he never has another political career, that he doesn't have a political base. And he's also worried that they are taking on too much power, that they're creating a big government that is going to seriously hurt the ability of poor white farmers in the South to make money, to rise. And so he becomes angrier and angrier at the Republican Party, especially the Republican Party members in the House of Representatives. And on that front, he is furious with House members like Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who wants black rights. He wants the government to get behind the idea of equal rights for African Americans. And he's mad at congressmen, look, there are no women then, congressmen who refuse to admit the southern states back to representation. The way that happens is this. Andrew Johnson has full control over Reconstruction from the time Lincoln is assassinated in mid-April of 1865 through the time that Congress comes back into session in December of 1865. That's a long time. So from April to December, he can do whatever he wants. And he does. He goes ahead and he organizes the southern states to come back in under a system of white supremacy that looks pretty much like what the South looked like before the Civil War, with the exception of slavery. He's pulled slavery out of the equation by forcing southern states to accept the 13th Amendment. He's also asked them to repudiate the Confederate debts, and he has also asked them to nullify the Articles of Confederation, the Articles of Secession, saying that in fact you can't do that, that it's not, they're null and void. There's no way a state can secede. So he's asked them to do that. And when Congress comes back in session, he says to them, you're done. Reconstruction's over. I took care of it while you were gone. And now all you have to do is seat the representatives and senators from the southern states. And they're already here, just waiting to take their seats in Congress, because at the end of the day, each the House and the Senate have responsibility for deciding who gets to sit in the chambers. So if they decide somebody has or hasn't been elected, they're the ones who get to decide who gets to come in. That's the prerogative of the Senate and the House. And the senators and the representatives look at this and they're like, this is not happening. These people were trying to kill us less than a year ago, and because we're coming up on a new census, if we admit them under the conditions that Johnson has required, they're going to have more power after 1870 than they did before the Civil War. And we just basically lost the Civil War by Johnson's new peace policy. So they said, no, we're not going to seat these people. And in answer, retaliation too, I guess, Johnson said, okay, fine. What you have done then is you have said that these southern states are not going to have representation in Congress, and therefore you, Congress, are an illegal body. You cannot legislate with, at that point, 11 states unrepresented. This is not a Republican government, and therefore you're an illegal body. Well, this, of course, imagine, you've just had a civil war that has had over 600,000 casualties, cost almost $6 billion. The country's been torn apart. The South runs out of black cloth because there's so many people in mourning that they actually don't have any cloth for people to wear any longer. And here you've got the president actually saying that Congress is an illegal body. So the Americans are really horrified. And at first the Republicans in Congress try to make nice with Johnson, and he doesn't want any part of it. He goes on what's called the swing around the circle in the summer of 1866, and he says, we're going to do this my way. And he goes out to the people and he says, you need to elect me. You need to make sure that the Democrats take over Congress in the midterm elections of 1866 so that we can have my plan put into effect across the South, that we're going to have Reconstruction on my terms, not on the terms of those radicals in Congress. And in the process of going on the swing around the circle, Johnson actually in many ways is like Donald Trump. He's a stump speaker. He's kind of a rough and tumble guy. He likes to fight back and forth with people in the audience. Not a good look for a president under any circumstances, but the swing around the circle was particularly bad because he really couldn't keep a level head. If you started to taunt Johnson, he would react and do the same. And in the course of his swing around the circle, he did a number of unfortunate things. First of all, he compared himself to Jesus Christ, which is really never a good look for anyone, let alone a politician and let alone a president. He also compared himself to Abraham Lincoln, saying that Lincoln had been martyred and he too was willing to be martyred, except that his cause was going to be the cause of small government. And he said that a number of members of Congress were traitors. He used the word traitors, and that they should be hanged. Okay, that's the president saying that members of Congress should be executed. Not because they had committed any kind of crimes, but because he was defining what they had done as treason. This is, to finish off what happens in the election, he gets creamed in the election. Americans want no part of that. He has sparked a number of riots across the South, and they don't want any part of that. And they actually turn around, and in the midterm election of 1866, they give the Republicans a supermajority in Congress so they can do whatever they want without any approval from Johnson. And what happens then is that the Republicans in Congress prepare articles of impeachment, and those articles of impeachment talk about abuse of power. They also talk about his attacks on Congress and his attempts to bring Congress into disrepute. All right, so in that impeachment trial, the House of Representatives impeaches Johnson, and when the Senate tries him, we discover the problem with an impeachment system during a partisan period, because Johnson is really problematic, and that's putting it lightly. He is in many ways almost sole-handedly responsible for the terrific racial problems in the South during Reconstruction. And as people who've been talking or been following me on Thursdays know, he is the one who brings together an ideology that equates a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people with communism. That's all Johnson. But nonetheless, the Democrats in Congress, along with a number of moderate Republicans who were terrified both of a return of civil war and of the idea that the person who will take over for Johnson, because of course in those days we had no appointment of a vice president after when a vice president moves to the presidency, the person who will replace Johnson, if he is removed from office, is quite a radical senator. Then the secession passed to the president of the Senate, and that was Benjamin Franklin Wade of Ohio, who wanted crazy things like women's rights. So they're really worried about Ben Wade taking over. He also wanted black rights, and he also wanted regulation of business and a fairer shake for workers. And that was just too much for a lot of moderate Republicans. So anyway, what happens is the impeachment of Johnson breaks down along partisan lines. And we get the specter of a man who should not have stayed in office, staying in office largely because his political party was not willing to let him go. So how does this play out today? Today, we have something that the founders never foresaw. And that is a system in which the members of Donald Trump's party, in the Senate, the people who theoretically are the ones who are supposed to judge as jurors in a trial whether or not he should have been impeached, not be guilty of a crime. Impeachment's not about crime, as I say, it's about abuse of power or high crimes and misdemeanors. They were supposed to decide about that, but they continue to back him on partisan issues. They don't care that he is really problematic as a president. They care that he is a member of their party, and that he is helping them both with his idea of the strong unitary executive and by packing the courts. Because by packing the courts with people who believe in a unitary executive and with judges who believe in business law, that the laws should help businessmen or business people, corporations, what the GOP is doing is they are managing to undercut popular opinion, and they know full well that they're in real trouble with voters, that most Americans don't actually like the direction that the GOP has taken of late, and they would like them out of office. But by going ahead and backing him and backing the judges that he's putting in office, there is less chance that that's going to happen. You can also make some guesses about some personal reasons that members of the GOP might be backing him, but I don't want to get into that right now, and a lot of it might be speculation anyway. This is important today because one of the things that the judges in office now, especially in the Supreme Court, are taking on as of this week is overturning of precedents. That is, generally the Supreme Court in the past has always liked precedent. It likes not to upset the apple cart. But as of this week, actually, they have begun to talk about overturning a number of precedents and how that maybe that's not such a bad thing. And when commentators are looking at this, they tend to be saying, oh my God, they're going after Roe v. Wade, which they almost certainly are. Roe v. Wade being the decision that permitted abortion in America, the 1973 decision. But I actually think that it's something else. That's that in part. But I actually think what they are, the reason they're talking about this now is because upcoming they have the case of whether or not Congress can issue subpoenas to see Donald Trump's finances, whether the Congress can or whether a state prosecutor in New York can get access to Trump's taxes and his finances to proceed in criminal cases. And the Trump administration is arguing that no, it cannot, because as the head of the executive department, he enjoys complete immunity from either being indicted for a crime, but also for being investigated for any crimes, so that you can't have criminal investigation of a sitting president. And that case is coming up in front of the Supreme Court this month. So I suspect, personally, I suspect they are looking to overturn the precedent that says, oh, come on, of course Congress can oversee the president. That's exactly what's in the Constitution. That's what courts have always said. My guess is they are looking to say, no, in fact, the unitary executive has no it can't be overseen by Congress or by a state prosecutor. Just my guess. It's Kavanaugh who's, I'm sorry, it's Justice Brett Kavanaugh who's out in front of that. And when he said that the court should talk about precedent and should wonder about precedent, one of the conditions he said in which the court should overturn precedent was that it should, quote, assess whether the precedent has caused significant negative jurisprudential or real-world consequences, unquote, which to me says he is open to the idea that the president should not be on the hook for answering subpoenas because it hurts him in real-world consequences. All right, just my guess there, but I think that's what's going on. All right, if that is why Trump is getting away with things that other presidents could not have and should not have, in my opinion anyway. Another question here from Andrea Chenoweth, Trudy Flaherty, and there was one other person I thought, maybe it's just the two of you, who wanted to know about the issue of individual rights and loss of freedom versus public health and the common good. It's really hot right now, as Andrea says, and what is the historical perspective on this? And Trudy Flaherty points out that she read somebody on Facebook saying that liberty is more essential than safety, and that that is what America is based on, and that that's why civil unrest is currently brewing. Okay, this is a great question. And it highlights a very real tension in American society. And that tension is between liberty, which is at the heart of our concept of equality, and public safety. Because obviously you don't have the liberty to do anything you want because we have laws about public safety. And what does that actually look like? And I'd like to start actually with this by talking about the idea that too much emphasis on public safety, I'm sympathetic to this argument, because too much emphasis on public safety can in fact turn into fascism. And I would point you to the movie Gabriel Over the White House, which was made in the 30s. And it was a movie, I believe it's a John Huston flick. And it's a movie in which, and I wonder how I can do this without giving away spoilers. It's a movie in which there's a president who's a rather Herbert Hoover kind of character. And he, I hate to give the spoilers here. He does something that results in the angel Gabriel taking over his body and ordering America as the divine being sees fit. And what's fascinating about that is it turns out that angel Gabriel is a fascist. You know, in order to protect public safety, for example, this president, who's now a divine being, just summarily executes people breaking the law. And that, of course, brings you full circle to the present when you have, for example, the president of the Philippines executing drug dealers on the argument that they are threatening the public safety without any kind of benefit of trial or anything. And so there's a real tension between saying, yeah, we need to protect ourselves, but by the same token, you could expand that an awfully long way, that you need to protect yourself from you name it, and a president could step in and take an inordinate amount of power. So I don't want to downplay the importance of that side of the argument. That is an important part of the argument. That being said, the issues of disease and the issues of war have always infringed on human liberty in America, on the liberty of people to do what they want. And there's a couple of great examples of that. There was an attempt at the turn of the last century to inoculate people against smallpox, which now you sit here and you think, well, that's a no-brainer. Like who wouldn't want to be inoculated against smallpox? Well, a lot of people didn't want to get inoculated against smallpox because they didn't trust the government. They thought that they were going to get the disease. And because when they actually did smallpox vaccinations in those days, they didn't do it with hypodermic needles. They actually messed up your arm, like cut into your arm and then spread the stuff on you, and it actually caused real soreness in your arm for a period of time. And if you were a manual laborer, as many people were, it made it very difficult for you to work. So it was seen as sort of reformers trying to put poor people out of work, especially put immigrants out of work. So there's a huge fight about whether or not the state has the power to do that. And ultimately, the courts decide that the state does have the power to stop the spread of smallpox, although it has to take into consideration legitimate objections, not just, I don't want to do it, but legitimate concerns from individuals about that kind of inoculation. Another thing that happened at a similar time is maybe even better compared to the smallpox vaccination. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in smallpox vaccination, there's a book by a friend of mine named Michael Wilrich called Pox, An American History, that I thought was fabulous on this question of inoculations at the turn of the last century. But more fun, more of a comparison to the present now was the issue of cattle quarantines. I can't believe I'm saying this, saying with a straight face. This is my life. This is what I do for fun. I actually read a ton about cattle quarantines once and thought about writing a cool article about it, but so far it hasn't happened. So I'm getting to use my cattle quarantine stuff. At the turn of the last century, there was a real problem on the cattle plains because cattle were coming down with something called Texas fever. And Texas fever was enormously debilitating. It was also highly contagious. And it turned out that the Texas fever, as it was known, it's got a fancier scientific name, was spread by cattle ticks. And cattle ticks, of course, spread easily cow to cow or beef to beef across the beef plains. So it's traveling up the grasslands, and the federal government and the state governments both are desperate to get a handle on it because it's killing the beef that are supposed to be feeding everybody back east, especially. So the federal and the state governments quarantine a bunch of cattle, and they insist on cattle inspections. And states start to have cattle inspection units to make sure that these cattle aren't traveling, and if they are sick, they get quarantined and they generally die, and that costs lots of money to the cattle raisers who have the damaged beef or the infested beef. By the way, there's all kinds of interesting ways that they try and get rid of the ticks, including they would dip the cattle in vats of water that had feet of oil on top of it, with the idea that the oil would coat the cattle and get rid of the ticks. It's important in just a second. So what happens then is that the people, the cattle raisers whose cattle are being quarantined and dying, insist that the cattle are not being affected by ticks, that it's something else. It's not the ticks, it's not the ticks. You guys are infringing on our liberty. You're taking our property by saying, by inventing this idea that the ticks are causing Texas fever. In fact, they organize as anti-dipping leagues. That's why I mentioned the dipping before. And they try and fight back. And they say, you know, they try and break out. They insist that that they're not, nobody's going to quarantine their cattle. And finally, the states threaten martial law. And they do, in fact, come down on the cattle industry. They do manage to quarantine the cattle with the ticks. Lots of cows die. And they do actually manage to eradicate the ticks that cause the Texas fever. Although they've started to come back lately, I'm not a huge worry because now we have pesticides that take care of them. But that's a great example of the place where people didn't want their livelihoods hit by a disease, and so they insisted, contrary to science, that that's not what was causing the disease. They were wrong, and the quarantining and the killing of, they didn't actually kill the cattle, but the cattle died, managed to get the epidemics under control. A number of historians have looked at this relationship of freedom to liberty, and they looked at the issue of the draft, which happens at about the same time. So I just gave you two cases that happened at the beginning of the 19th century, but of course then you're going to have the nationwide draft under World War I, and that's a really big deal, because can the government do that? Can the government literally say you have to give up your life for this country? And of course, during World War I, the courts decide, yeah, the government can say, we have the right to draft you. And that's a really big deal. If anybody's interested in that, there's a book called Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and Making of the Modern American Citizen by Chris Capizzola, a guy at MIT. It's about 10 years old now, that book. And yet, another book written about the same period of time, Gaines Foster's Moral Reconstruction, Christian Lobbyists and the Federal Legislation of Morality, took a look at the fact that about the same time, a number of people wanted to engraft onto the Constitution amendment saying that this was a Christian nation. And lawmakers and people both pushed back and said, no, the government can take your life, but it cannot force you to adopt a religious stance. And that's why we didn't ever get a Christian amendment to the Constitution. I would also point out that the idea between liberty and public health here reflects, I think, a gender difference in the way politically, men have represented themselves in the public sphere and women have represented themselves in the public sphere. So the idea of a man being in charge of a nuclear family, a heteronormative nuclear family, really emphasizes the idea of liberty, whereas people who are looking at community are much more interested in public health. And often you see that as a gender difference. And I mention that because when today people talk about liberty, you know, they're really not talking about, most of them are really not talking about actual liberty, the kind of philosophical liberty I'm talking about here. They're really embracing a political platform, and that political platform is one that the Republican Party has shaped itself around since the 1980s with the rise of Ronald Reagan. And that really emphasizes the idea that the nation's about individualism. It talks about how government is not the solution to a problem, government is the problem. It emphasizes the idea of people being able to do what they want without regulation, without the government taxing them for to promote social welfare programs or infrastructure. It really is a political stance that reflects, interestingly enough, the idea that the Confederates embraced before the Civil War, and that was the idea that the government should do nothing other than promote individualism. Of course, the downside of that, and this is a lovely thought, but the downside of that is if the government does nothing but promote the idea of people being able to do whatever they want, invariably that leads to a few people first becoming very wealthy and then taking over control of the political system. So the moments in America when you get the idea that the government should do nothing except promote liberty, as they did during the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1920s, and the 2000 aughts, invariably you get a stratification of wealth. More and more money moves to the top, more and more power moves to the top, and eventually you get a situation like we are looking at now, where you are forced with making some kind of a correction. So when people nowadays talk about liberty, they're really not making a philosophical argument like I just made about the relationship between public safety and liberty. They're really just saying, I don't believe that the government should regulate business or raise taxes or not even raise, or to consume taxes to provide a basic social safety net or infrastructure, because that hampers my ability to rise. Of course, nowadays it really is only hampering the ability of a very few people, because the wealth is stratified so that only a few people can take advantage of that situation. And that again goes back to where the modern day Republican Party came from, and its formulation really in the 1950s in reaction to the New Deal and Eisenhower's middle way, and now of course in its attempt to get rid of those programs, to get rid of regulation and social safety nets and infrastructure. All right, so if that's liberty, here is another one from that I'm going to not do as much with as I would like to, from two people. I've got Megan Feel asking, is it likely there'll be a run on the bank similar to 1929, and if so, what it look like? And somebody else, and I'm afraid I didn't grab the name here, saying, I'd love to understand more about the national debt and the borrowing and spending that we're doing now, and how Republicans find it so easy to deficit spend when they're in power, but quickly become deficit hawks when Democrats are in power. All right, first of all, will there be a run on the banks? Nope. We now have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is protecting our bank accounts. The reason we got such a huge run in 1929 is when banks fell in the 1920s, they just simply took your money with you. Now you have your money in an if you're smart, you've got your money in an FDIC insured bank, which will make sure that you're protected to, I forget what the numbers are, 100,000 per account or something. Check. I'm not a banker. Just make sure you're in an FDIC insured corporation, an FDIC insured bank, and that will mean that Americans will have confidence in their banks unless we really go into trouble. And when that's the case, perhaps banking will be the least of our worries if things get that bad. I'd like to talk more about the formation of the FDIC, but I don't really have time now. A couple things I want to say about the debt. Most people confuse debt and deficit, and that's a really important distinction. The deficit is the amount of money that we spend without being able to pay for it. It's the amount that we are yearly in the red. So if, and I'm going to make these numbers up, if Congress spends $100 million and it picks up and we only get $50 million in taxes, we would have a $50 million deficit. We're in the red there. That's very different than debt. A national debt is philosophically part of the American system. It comes from Alexander Hamilton. He's the one who thought a debt was a good thing. Thomas Jefferson, who loathed Hamilton thought a debt was a terrible thing. But Hamilton made the argument that if, in fact, you have a national debt, what that means is that men of wealth, and it was men in those days, of course, men of wealth will literally own a piece of the government by owning bonds. And if they own bonds and therefore own a piece of the government, they have an interest in the government continuing to function. It matters to them. They want to get their money back. And so he deliberately created a debt to tie Americans together and to make sure that Americans were invested in their country. So when we talk about a debt, we should talk about it very differently than we talk about a deficit. All right, deficits tend to be, in American history, people don't like deficits. They find deficits scary. And they always tried to make sure that they operated in the black. And when they couldn't operate in the black because of wartime especially, what they tried to do was to raise taxes until they managed to balance out their deficits. And then later on to pay down their debts. We've never paid off our debt. Again, there's a philosophical objection to paying off the debt, but to pay off the deficits. And you see this with every war until the present wars. Certainly we had very high taxes. We actually invent taxes during the American Civil War. It's the Republican Party who invents taxes during the war, including income taxes. We have very high taxes during World War I, and coming out of World War II, the top marginal tax rate is 91% under Eisenhower. It's finally JFK who lowers taxes during the wartime taxes during his administration. Our relationship to deficits and to the debt, because of course if you have deficits, it adds to the debt, changed dramatically under Ronald Reagan, who advanced a philosophy called supply-side economics. And what they were arguing in the Reagan years was that if you simply provided more money to the top of the economy, to the supply side, rather than to the demand side, that's the people at the bottom who are demanding consumer goods, that instead of putting money down below so people can buy stuff, if you put money at the top so that people can create more jobs, what you can do is you can cut taxes, because if you cut taxes, more money will go to the supply side, they'll create more jobs, growth will increase, and then you're going to get more taxes, and people are going to, and the deficits will go down. This was what George H.W. Bush called voodoo economics before the election of 1980. And when, in fact, Reagan went into office and his director of the Office of Management, his budget director, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, that's David Stockman, actually went ahead and cut the previous year's budget and cut taxes. He actually put the numbers into the computers at the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And when that happened, the computers said that the plan to cut taxes and thereby increase growth and tax revenue, rather than wiping out the deficits, it would create a budget deficit up to $116 billion by 1984. When that happened, Stockman simply reprogrammed the computers and said, well, we know it must work. And what he said to a reporter was, quote, none of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. And he rationalized that he would put what they called a magic asterisk on the budget lines, promising that there would be future cuts in these areas to help bring the deficits under control. He said it all comes down to what you believe, and we believe this is going to happen. All right, for all that, Ronald Reagan did in his time raise taxes 11 times to try and knock out the deficits. And under George H.W. Bush, he rose taxes to try and combat the extraordinary debt that Reagan had piled up during his 2 terms. That's where we get that, the problem with George H.W. Bush saying, read my lips, no new taxes. And then he went ahead and raised taxes because he had to do something about the deficits. And also there was an economic crisis, a savings and loans crisis on his watch, which meant that he had to find more money to bail out the savings and loan enterprises. That, together with some of the policies of the Clinton administration, more raised taxes, meant that after 1998, very briefly, we actually had budget surpluses. The last Republican president to produce a balanced budget was Dwight Eisenhower. It has not happened for Republicans since Eisenhower. Clinton did it as a Democrat after 1998. And when George W. Bush took office in 2001, he instantly proposed $1 trillion tax cut. He didn't get that much. That's what he proposed, because he was trying to wipe out that surplus, because the whole philosophy of the Republican Party by then was that you did not want an activist government because it would regulate business and provide a basic social safety net, and that would cause taxes and infringe on liberty. Here's that theme coming back again. What happened then was that Bush does get a major tax cut, and when the Republicans win in the midterms of 2002, the administration immediately calls for further tax cuts. And when that happens, the Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Paul O'Neill, said, the budgets are out of control and we're creating this enormous debt. What are we going to do? And Dick Cheney shot back at him, quote, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, unquote. And O'Neill was so horrified, he actually left the administration over that. And he said later that the Bush administration was operating solely on ideology, and that made for very easy governing. He commented, quote, because you don't have to know anything or search for anything. You already know the answer to everything. It's not penetrable by facts. It's absolutism. And I'd like to note, by the way, that Paul O'Neill died this week after years later. Of course, this has gone into the Trump administration, and Trump has promoted more and more tax cuts, and we've even had tax cuts, as you know, in the coronavirus relief package, because of the idea that what you really want to do is keep funneling money upward, because those job creators are going to provide more jobs for people at the bottom. All right. Finally, I want to take on two questions here. One by from Joey Ryan, three from Joey Ryan, from John T. Miller, and from Stephen Thuman, about why Americans are, as Joey says, rejecting the evidence of their eyes and ears. Like, why are people refusing to admit that that COVID-19 is a real thing? And why are people refusing to believe what is reality? To anybody paying attention. And John Miller says, how is it that oligarchs have retained support? And finally, Steve Thuman has asked, how do I get through to Fox News viewers? I have tried to get through to them with little success. Any ideas? All right. So I'm going to take this on very briefly. I'm sorry about the broken video today, but these are obviously good questions aiming for the same thing. And I'm going to start from Steve's question first. And that is, I get this all the time. People say to me, how can I convince my father of the fact that he shouldn't watch Fox News? How can I challenge the people who think this way? And my understanding of historical psychology is that you can't. There's no point. This is a waste of your time. And the way to think about it is to think, and my understanding of this comes first of all from my understanding of Eric Hoffer's work in The True Believers, but it's also compounded from that, from a lot of work I then have done in literary theory and in psychological theory. And that is, a way to think about this is to think about that person, we all know somebody who is locked in an abusive relationship. Like, the more you say to your friend, this isn't healthy, this is not this is, you need to get away from this person. The more you say that, the more the tighter they cling, the more they think of reasons why this is the right thing for them, because they are so psychologically invested in this particular relationship. You can't, hitting it head on doesn't do anything except frustrate both of you. The way to approach somebody, either politically locked into a position or really in any other way that seems unhealthy, is simply to model a healthy relationship. And that is what I tell people, again, when they want to take on somebody who watches Fox. You're never going to change their minds if you hit it head on. All you can do is model what should be a healthy relationship in a democracy, what your rights and duties are as a citizen, and what the rights and duties of the government are, and whether or not you think it's okay for the president to talk this way, or whether or not this is what you want from a democratic system. And the reality is, you're not going to reach everybody. And you never do. I mean, even Hitler had supporters when he committed suicide. You're never going to reach everybody. And I would point out that historically and statistically, it takes somebody in an abusive relationship 7 tries to leave an abuser. There's a reason for that. It's because they are psychologically committed to that relationship. And there's all kinds of other things that go along with that, of course. I'm not trying to make an exact parallel between the two. But I feel so for you people who are trying to convince your friends who watch Fox to get out of the bubble. And the harder you push, I think, the harder it makes it possible to do that. I will point out that for all the fact that there are so many bad personal relationships around us, most of us still strive for healthy ones, and we like to see healthy ones modeled. So it's not that this bad system has to prevail. It simply is that it's the pattern that the Republican Party is in right now with its supporters, and they've gotten there over a long period of time, and they're not going to fall out of it instantly at all. But, now that Americans are starting to talk about what a good democracy looks like and what it means to participate and what we want out of our government, I think that revival of a real conversation about what democracy should be and what is a healthy relationship between a political party and a member of a political party, and what is a healthy relationship between a political party and its leadership, is actually a very healthy thing and continues to model what should be the basis of our American democratic system. So have heart, for sure, but maybe better simply to model a healthy political experience than to try and convince anybody to participate in it. All right, I'm sorry about the break in this, but it looks like this took off okay afterward. I hope that was useful. If that was of note, I will see you back here on Tuesday. And for anybody who wants to pick up the history, I'll be back here at 1 o'clock on Thursday talking about the late 19th century and how that ties into the American paradox that I've been developing for the past 4 weeks. Thank you very much.